So what does explain the fact that the knights did manage to withstand those 4 months and the Turks eventually embarked and disappeared?
There are a number of factors. They were at the end of their operational limit. Malta is extremely barren. If you've ever been to Malta, it offers nothing really. There's no wood, there's no water. They had to take everything with them. Maltese population, who they thought might defect to them, stuck by the knights to a man. They would have died to the last child in defence of their stony little fields. The knights were extremely good at defending fortified places. They'd had several hundred years of hunkering down behind bastions and being quite often massacred by the forces of Islam. But they were very, very good at defending fortified places. And although numerically the numbers are very asymmetrical, 20,000, maybe 25,000 Ottomans and maybe 8,000 Christian forces, given the fortifications that they had, they were a tough nut to crack. And in the end, they were relieved from Sicily, and the Ottomans had to pull back.
I mentioned already that your narrative is extremely vivid and colourful. And I wondered, what kind of sources do you have to draw on in order to construct it? I imagine you have to be really careful with trusting a lot of these sources, given the sort of polarisation of positions, the sort of ideological lens through which these events are seen.
It is interesting, actually. I think the history of the 16th century and the book that I've written is almost a hurrah for the invention of printing, actually, compared with the fall of Constantinople in the last previous century, for which the sources are very minimal. The sources are huge for this. A vast amount of material was being produced, eyewitness accounts. They were producing broadsheets in Italy by the day as news leaked out of Malta. There were diaries written at the time. There are quite a number of wonderful eyewitness accounts from the 16th century. But the sources are asymmetrical. The Ottomans produced very, very little, and it's very tough to balance up the two sides. You get a vast amount of personal material from the Christian side, about individual fates and events, and you tend to get lists from the Ottomans about how many bushels of wheat and sacks of gunpowder they sent over. I think a lot of Suleiman's imperial records have actually been lost, but they didn't have this tradition of writing personal accounts. I think the transmission of history in Ottoman times is very much of an oral thing. So you have to try and reconstruct the Ottoman side by reading between the lines of the Christian accounts, some of which are very, very detailed about what the Ottomans did and what they said. There have been one or two things about Malta where they have retrieved some naval records, which are quite interesting. But it's hard. You have to work hard to try and maintain a sense of balance.
So your book concludes in 1571 with the Battle of Lepanto, which the Turks are defeated by this alliance of Christian forces. Am I understanding it correctly that this really was the end of the Mediterranean as the centre of the world, and after that those nations turned to other struggles, other priorities, and no longer was the Mediterranean really the epicentre of the whole of civilization?
It's symbolic of that decline, I think. What was realised at the Battle of Lepanto, although the Christians absolutely annihilated the Ottoman fleet, was that a maritime war was unwinnable given the resources available, and both sides tacitly withdrew from the contest. They signed a treaty in 1580, but it was almost symbolic of some larger movement away from the Mediterranean, things that had happened to change the balance of power. I mean, in 1500, the Portuguese sailed round Africa and were starting to source spices from the Orient directly. The maritime powers of Northern Europe, the entrepreneurial seamen of Holland and England, were starting to sail galleons, moving away from the old galley. And it symbolised the end, I suppose, of the old world as being the centre of a world, and the start of a new maritime-based, ocean-going phase of imperial expansion. In that respect, the Battle of Lepanto was the last hurrah of that older civilization and that older way of fighting wars.